In the winter of 1947, a geological survey team ventured into a nameless valley 40 miles southwest of Fairbanks and discovered something that should not have existed. A homestead preserved beneath centuries of ice, containing the frozen remains of 11 individuals arranged in a perfect circle around a hand-carved altar of blackened wood. What made the discovery inexplicable was not merely the positioning of the bodies, but the fact that carbon dating would later place the wooden structure at approximately 300 years old, predating any known European settlement in interior Alaska by nearly a century, while the clothing on the corpses belonged unmistakably to the late 19th century. The eldest victim appeared to be a woman in her late 60s, the youngest a child no older than 11. None of them bore any marks of violence. Their faces, preserved in the perpetual cold, wore expressions that the lead surveyor would later describe in his only interview on the subject as not quite fear and not quite rapture, but something that existed in the terrible space between. The homestead became known, in the sparse documentation that followed, as Black Hollow, though no official map has ever borne that name, and no county record acknowledges its existence. Wait, before we proceed to the archives. If this enigma has already captured your curiosity, tell us where in the world you're joining this investigation from. To make sure you never miss another hidden truth or forgotten theory, subscribe and join our search. History has not yet revealed all of its secrets. Now, back to the facts. The Alaska Triangle, that vast expanse of wilderness bounded roughly by Juneau, Anchorage, and Barrow, has claimed more than 16,000 people since records began in 1988. Aircraft vanish from radar without distress calls. Experienced hunters disappear between their camps and nearby streams. Entire villages have been found abandoned, with meals still sitting on tables and fires recently extinguished. The conventional explanations cite extreme weather, difficult terrain, magnetic anomalies that confound navigation equipment, and the simple truth that Alaska is a place where nature has not yet fully yielded to human dominion. But Black Hollow defies even these generous parameters of the explicable. The 1947 discovery was never officially reported to the public. The survey team had been contracted by a private mining consortium investigating copper deposits in the region, and their findings were classified under corporate confidentiality agreements that, conveniently, shielded the discovery from archaeological oversight. What little we know comes from three sources: a fragmentary journal kept by Michael Thornton, the survey team's geologist, a series of photographs that surfaced in an estate sale in Anchorage in 1983, and a single memorandum from the territorial government's Department of Interior Affairs, dated March 12, 1948, which tersely acknowledges the removal and disposal of historical remains from an unauthorized settlement in the Tanana Valley region without further elaboration. Thornton's journal entries from February 1947 are matter-of-fact in their early pages, documenting ore samples and geological formations with professional precision. Then, on February 18th, the tone shifts abruptly. Found the hollow today. Erickson wanted to turn back immediately. Can't blame him. The place emanates wrongness, the way a furnace emanates heat. But curiosity, or perhaps something less noble, compelled us forward. The team consisted of 5 men: Thornton, the geologist, Robert Erickson, a surveyor, James Holbrook and Peter Chen, both mining engineers, and a local guide named Samuel Kaltag, an Athabascan man from the village of Nanana who knew the winter trails better than any white man in the territory. It was Kaltag who first noticed the anomaly. A depression in the snow that ran too straight and too deliberate to be a natural formation. Following it, they discovered the remnants of a path, carved into the permafrost decades or perhaps centuries earlier, leading down into a hollow surrounded on 3 sides by steep, forested ridges. At the bottom of the hollow stood what remained of a log structure, not a cabin exactly, but something between a cabin and a chapel. The roof had collapsed inward, but the walls stood firm, chinked with moss and clay that had frozen solid long ago. The door hung from one leather hinge, revealing the darkness within. Kaltag refused to enter, Thornton wrote. He spoke in his own language, rapidly, and though I understood little of Athabascan, I recognized the cadence of prayer. When Erickson pressed him for an explanation, he said only, "The old people knew not to name this place. There is a reason it has no name." The 4 white men entered without him. The interior was a single room, approximately 20 feet square. Light filtered through gaps in the collapsed roof, illuminating a scene that Thornton struggled to describe adequately. The bodies, 11 in total, sat in a perfect circle, facing inward. They had frozen in position, their backs straight, their hands resting on their knees. In the center of the circle stood a rectangular altar, roughly 3 feet high, constructed from wood that had been scorched black, either by fire or by some other process. On the altar lay a book, sealed in what appeared to be oiled leather, and beside it a collection of objects, carved bone figures, iron nails bent into strange size, strips of cloth inscribed with symbols that resembled no alphabet Thornton recognized. Holbrook reached for the book, Thornton recorded. Erickson stopped him. "We document first," he said. But I could see it in Holbrook's eyes, the same thing I felt in myself. An irrational conviction that the book contained answers, that it had been waiting here for someone to find it, that it wanted to be read. They spent 3 hours photographing the scene from every angle, using the survey team's documentation cameras. The photographs that survived, 7 in total, reveal details that Thornton's prose could not fully capture. The faces of the dead are eerily serene, almost beatific. Their clothing, though frozen and partially decayed, is clearly late Victorian. Wool coats with bone buttons, canvas trousers, boots with hobnailed soles. One of the bodies, a young woman in her 20s, wears a dress with lace collar and cuffs, incongruous in this frontier setting. The youngest victim, the child, sits between 2 adults who might have been parents, though their features offer no clear familial resemblance. The altar itself is the most disturbing element. The wood appears to have been carved with deliberate precision, its surface covered in repeating geometric patterns that create an optical illusion. Stare at them long enough, and they seem to shift and reconfigure, though the photograph remains static. The symbols on the cloth strips resist easy interpretation. They bear some resemblance to Scandinavian runes, but also to certain indigenous pictographic traditions and to alchemical notation from medieval Europe. It is as if the author of these symbols had drawn from multiple esoteric traditions and synthesized them into something new, something purpose-built for a function we can only guess at. Chen, whose family had emigrated from Guangdong province 2 generations earlier, observed that one of the bone figures resembled a jiangshi, a Chinese hopping vampire, though he admitted the resemblance might be coincidental. Holbrook, who had studied comparative religion at Yale before the Depression forced him into engineering work, suggested the arrangement mimicked certain Cathar or Gnostic ritual configurations described in medieval texts. Erickson told them both to stop speculating and focus on documentation. But it was Thornton who noticed the most disturbing detail. The bodies were not emaciated. Despite being frozen for what might have been decades, they showed no signs of starvation or prolonged deprivation. Their faces were full, their hands unclenched by hunger's agony. Whatever had killed them had done so suddenly, or they had chosen their deaths voluntarily while still in full health. I hypothesized carbon monoxide poisoning, Thornton wrote. A faulty stove, inadequate ventilation. It would explain the peaceful expressions, the lack of struggle. But there was no stove, no chimney, no source of heat at all, except the bodies themselves, and they had long since surrendered their warmth to the merciless cold. They extracted the book and several of the artifacts, placing them in insulated containers meant for geological samples. Kaltog, waiting outside with the dog sled, refused to touch any of the items. He asked us to leave them, Thornton recorded. He said, "Some things are buried for good reason. Some things should not return to the light." We ignored him. God forgive us, we ignored him. The survey team made camp 3 miles from the hollow that night. According to Thornton's journal, none of them slept well. Chen reported dreams of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand but somehow comprehended perfectly. Holbrook woke screaming at 2 a.m., claiming he'd seen the child from the hollow standing at the edge of the firelight, gesturing for him to follow. Erickson, the most skeptical and pragmatic of the group, admitted to a profound sense of unease that he couldn't rationally justify. Only Kaltog seemed at peace, though he stationed himself deliberately between the white men's tents and the direction of the hollow, and he kept his rifle across his lap throughout the night. They reached Fairbanks 5 days later, on February 24th, and immediately contacted the Mining Consortium's regional office. What happened next is where the historical record becomes fragmentary and contradictory. Thornton's journal entries after February 24th are sporadic and increasingly erratic. The Mining Consortium's files, obtained decades later through a complex legal settlement involving environmental violations, contain only a terse memo directing the survey team to surrender all materials to appropriate territorial authorities and to sign confidentiality agreements under penalty of contract violation. The territorial government's Department of Interior Affairs, which should have taken custody of the artifacts and overseen any archaeological investigation, has no comprehensive file on Black Hollow. The single memorandum from March 1948 mentions disposal but provides no details about where the bodies were taken, whether they were autopsied, or what became of the artifacts. It is as if someone deliberately scrubbed the official record, removing every trace except what was necessary to create plausible deniability. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and in the forgotten corners of Alaska's historical archives, fragments of the truth remained, waiting for someone persistent enough to find them. The first substantial clue emerged in 1956 when a doctoral student named Helen Vargas, researching frontier religious movements for her dissertation at the University of Washington, stumbled across a reference to the Frostborn sect in a collection of letters housed at the Alaska State Library in Juneau. The letters had been donated by the family of a Presbyterian missionary named Reverend Thomas Ashworth, who had traveled through interior Alaska between 1889 and 1894, attempting to bring Christianity to both indigenous communities and the scattered settlements of white prospectors and trappers. In a letter dated November 3, 1892, addressed to his sister in Seattle, Ashworth described an encounter that had left him deeply disturbed. "I have met, in my travels, many who have turned from God's light toward strange and terrible philosophies. But I have never before encountered a group so thoroughly convinced of their own righteousness, nor one whose beliefs struck me as so profoundly dangerous. They call themselves the Frostborn, for they believe that in the moment of perfect cold, when the body surrenders to winter's embrace, the soul achieves a clarity impossible in the heat of ordinary life. Their leader, a woman they call only Mother, claims to have died and returned during a blizzard in the winter of '88. She speaks with eerie conviction about what she saw on the other side, though she will not describe it directly, saying that language is inadequate to the task. Her followers number perhaps 15 souls, including several children, which grieves me most deeply. They have established themselves in a hidden valley southwest of here, in a place even the Athabascan people avoid. When I offered to bring them back to civilization to minister to their spiritual needs, Mother smiled. I cannot forget that smile, and said, 'Civilization is the illness, Reverend. We have found the cure.' I departed with great heaviness of heart, knowing that I had failed them, or perhaps that they had failed themselves. Vargas' dissertation, Apocalyptic Expectations on the American Frontier, 1850 to 1900, devoted only 3 pages to the Frostborn, treating them as a minor curiosity among the many millennial movements that flourished in isolated regions during the late 19th century. She noted parallels with the Shakers, who practiced celibacy and believed in direct communion with spirits, and with certain Russian mystical sects that had emigrated to Alaska during the Russian colonial period. But she found no additional documentation about the group's fate, and her academic career took her in other directions. The Frostborn became a footnote, then not even that, simply another ghost in the vast haunted house of frontier history. The second clue surfaced in 1968 in a context completely unrelated to Alaska. A journalist named Marcus Webb, investigating financial irregularities at a private museum in Boston, discovered that the institution had acquired in 1949 a collection of Arctic ethnographic materials from an anonymous donor. The collection included several carved bone figures, strips of cloth with unusual markings, and a book described in the acquisition records as a devotional text of uncertain origin, possibly Scandinavian-American, late 19th century. Webb, whose investigation focused on the museum's questionable acquisition practices rather than the artifacts themselves, mentioned the collection only in passing in his exposé for the Boston Globe. But his article included a black-and-white photograph of one of the bone figures. And that photograph caught the attention of a retired mining engineer named James Holbrook, who wrote a letter to the Globe 2 weeks later. "I recognize that object," Holbrook's letter stated. "I was present at its discovery 21 years ago, in circumstances I am not at liberty to discuss in detail. But I can say that it should not be in a museum in Boston. It should not be anywhere. Some discoveries are better left buried." The Globe did not follow up on Holbrook's letter. Webb, interviewed decades later by a researcher investigating the Black Hollow mystery, said he'd found Holbrook's claim melodramatic and unlikely. How could a mining engineer from Alaska possibly recognize an artifact in a Boston museum? He'd dismissed it as the rambling of an old man seeking attention. But Holbrook's letter had been sincere, and it would not be the last time someone from the 1947 survey team tried to warn others about what they'd found. The Alaska Athabascan oral tradition, passed down through families and preserved now in recorded interviews conducted by anthropologists and linguists, contains references to a place called Yega Tsen, the hollow without a name, or the place that refuses names. The stories vary in their details, but certain elements remain consistent. It is a location where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world grows thin, where those who seek power through improper means are drawn, where the dead sometimes linger because they have unfinished business or because they have been bound by unnatural means. Peter John, a traditional chief from Minto who was interviewed in 1974 as part of the Alaska Native Language Center's Oral History Project, spoke about Yega Tsen with evident reluctance. "My grandfather told me about that place. He said it was old even when his grandfather was young. The old people knew not to go there. They said it belonged to the spirits who came before the people, before the animals, when the world was still being dreamed. In the early days, maybe 1880s, some white people went there. The trappers and prospectors, they went everywhere, looking for gold, for furs, for land. Most of them learned the land and respected it, but some of them, they brought different ideas, old country ideas from across the water, ideas about how to cheat death, how to live forever. The spirits listened to those ideas, and the spirits laughed, because you cannot cheat death. You can only change what it costs." Peter John refused to elaborate further, saying only that some stories are told so that we remember not to repeat the mistakes, but some stories are dangerous even in the telling. The anthropologist conducting the interview noted that Peter John seemed genuinely frightened, not for himself, but for her, for the potential consequences of spreading knowledge that should remain contained. These fragments, Ashworth's letter, Holbrook's warning, the Athabascan oral traditions remained disconnected for decades, scattered across different archives and different media, waiting for someone to recognize the pattern. That recognition would finally come in 1983 when a young folklore researcher named Dr. Sarah Lindstrom, working on a comparative study of frontier death rituals, encountered all three sources within the span of 6 months. Lindstrom had been drawn to Alaska by her fascination with how isolated communities create meaning around mortality. Her research took her to churches, libraries, and native cultural centers across the state. She interviewed elders, read missionary journals, and examined burial customs from multiple cultural traditions. And slowly, she began to see connections that others had missed. References to the hollow, to those who seek the perfect cold, to a group that had vanished in the 1890s under mysterious circumstances. When she discovered Michael Thornton's journal in the papers of his daughter, donated to the University of Alaska Fairbanks archives after the daughter's death in 1981, Lindstrom realized she had found something extraordinary. Here was documentary evidence of a discovery that had been deliberately suppressed, connected to a religious movement documented by a missionary, linked to oral traditions that warned against the very location where the survey team had made their grim find. Lindstrom spent 2 years attempting to reconstruct the full story. She tracked down surviving family members of the survey team, though by 1983, all the principals except Robert Erickson had died. She examined the photographs that had surfaced in the Anchorage estate sale and confirmed they matched the descriptions in Thornton's journal. She contacted the Boston Museum and successfully argued for permission to examine the artifacts, though she was denied permission to open the sealed book, which the museum had never properly conserved and was reluctant to expose to air after decades in storage. Most significantly, she made contact with descendants of Samuel Kaltag and, with their permission and blessing, recorded interviews that provided crucial context for understanding what the survey team had actually discovered in Black Hollow. Thomas Kaltag, Samuel's grandson, shared stories that his grandfather had told him in the years before Samuel's death in 1962. He said the white men thought they'd found something abandoned, something dead, Thomas recalled, but he knew better. He said some places remember, some places hold on to what happened there, and they wait. He told me he could feel it. The hollow was waiting for someone to disturb it, to take things away that should have stayed. He said it was like a trap, baited with mystery, with the promise of knowledge, and the white men took the bait. According to Samuel Kaltag's account, as passed through his grandson, the Frostborn had not died by accident or even by ordinary suicide. They had been attempting something, a ritual, a transformation, a crossing over. The details were unclear, even to Samuel, who'd learned about the hollow from his own elders as a warning rather than as history. But the essential fact was this: the Frostborn believed that in the moment of death by freezing, at the precise instant when the body ceased generating warmth, consciousness expanded and touched something beyond ordinary reality. They sought to die together, in a state of meditation or prayer, and in doing so, to achieve a collective enlightenment that would persist beyond death. Whether they had succeeded or failed, no one could say. But Samuel believed that the hollow itself had changed after the Frostborn performed their final ritual, that it had become a kind of metaphysical scar, a place where the membrane between worlds had been torn and imperfectly healed. He told me the white men's mistake was thinking the bodies were the discovery, Thomas Kaltag said. The bodies were the warning. The real discovery was what the Frostborn had done to that place, what they'd opened up. And by taking the artifacts, by removing the physical anchors of the ritual, the white men had broken a containment. They'd let something loose. Dr. Lindstrom's research took a strange turn in the spring of 1985. She had been attempting to locate Robert Erickson, the only surviving member of the 1947 survey team, to conduct an interview. Erickson proved difficult to find. He left Alaska in 1952 and spent the subsequent decades moving frequently, working as a freelance surveyor for various projects across the western United States. Lindstrom finally tracked him to a VA nursing home in Eugene, Oregon, where Erickson, now in his 70s and suffering from advanced emphysema, agreed to speak with her. The interview, recorded on cassette tape and later transcribed, provides the most detailed first-hand account of what the survey team experienced at Black Hollow. But it also reveals that the story did not end with their departure from the site. "We thought we'd gotten away clean," Erickson told Lindstrom, his voice rough and labored. "We turned over the artifacts, signed the papers, took our pay, and went our separate ways. Holbrook went back east. Chen took a job with a mining operation in Nevada. Thornton stayed in Alaska, kept working for the consortium. Calfag went back to his village. And I tried to forget, but it didn't let us forget." According to Erickson, within 6 months of the Black Hollow expedition, every member of the survey team had begun experiencing similar phenomena: vivid dreams of the hollow, waking visions of the frozen figures, and an inexplicable compulsion to return to the site. Thornton, in his fragmentary post-expedition journal entries, had alluded to these experiences, but never described them fully. Erickson was willing to be more explicit. "The dreams were wrong," he said. "They didn't feel like normal dreams. They felt like memories, but memories of things that hadn't happened to me, things that belonged to someone else. I would dream I was sitting in that circle with the others around me, and we would be singing. Not in English, not in any language I recognized, but I understood what we were singing about. We were singing about the threshold, about the crossing, about the price and the prize waiting on the other side." Erickson reported that he would wake from these dreams feeling profoundly cold, even in summer, even in heated rooms. His hands would be numb for hours. Once, he woke to find frost on his window pane, on the inside of the glass, despite the warm California night outside. Holbrook experienced something similar, though more severe. In a letter to Erickson, dated July 1948, one of the few pieces of correspondence Erickson had kept, Holbrook described episodes of missing time where he would lose hours with no memory of what he'd done. He would find himself in strange locations, once in a park 15 miles from his home, once in the basement of a church he'd never entered before, with no recollection of how he'd arrived there. Most disturbing, he would occasionally wake to find strange symbols drawn on his skin in ink, symbols that matched those on the cloth strips from the altar. "He was terrified," Erickson said. "He thought he was losing his mind. He checked himself into a psychiatric hospital in Boston for observation." They found nothing wrong, no schizophrenia, no organic brain damage. But the episodes continued. Peter Chen's fate was more tragic. In December 1949, he disappeared while working at a silver mine in Nevada. His co-workers reported that he'd been behaving strangely for weeks, talking about voices in the deep places and insisting that something was calling him northward. On December 15th, he failed to report for his shift. A search found his truck abandoned at a trailhead 20 miles from the mine. His footprints led north, into the wilderness, despite the beginning of a severe winter storm. The tracks continued for 3 miles, then simply stopped, in the middle of an open field with no shelter, no trees, nothing. It was as if he'd been lifted into the air or had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. His body was never recovered. "That's when I knew," Erickson said. "That's when I understood that we'd taken something we shouldn't have, and it wasn't going to let us go. Not ever." Thornton died in 1951, officially of a heart attack while surveying a construction site near Anchorage. But Erickson received a letter from one of Thornton's colleagues describing the circumstances more fully. Thornton had been found in his tent, frozen solid, despite the fact that his heater was working properly and the temperature inside should have been well above freezing. His expression, the colleague wrote, was peaceful, almost rapturous, not the face of a man who died of heart failure. Samuel Kaltag survived longer than the white men, dying in 1962 of natural causes at the age of 78. But according to his grandson Thomas, Samuel had been plagued by nightmares for the rest of his life. Dreams of the hollow, of the Frostborn rising from their circle and walking through the snow toward his village, their frozen hands reaching out, their voices calling his name. He said he should have stopped them, Thomas Kaltag told Dr. Lindstrom. He said he knew better, but had let curiosity or pride or the white men's money convince him to guide them to that place. He carried that guilt until the day he died. And he made us promise, my father, my uncles, me, that we would never go near that hollow, that we would never speak its location to anyone, that we would let it remain what it had always been, a warning, not a destination. By the time of Lindstrom's interview with Erickson in 1985, he was the last surviving member of the expedition. He had spent 38 years running from what they'd found, never staying in one place long, never forming close relationships, always moving when the dreams began to intensify. But age and illness had finally trapped him. "I know I'm dying," he told Lindstrom. "The emphysema is bad, but it's not just that. I can feel it, the cold. It's inside me now. It's been creeping into my bones for years, and I can't get warm anymore, no matter how high they turn the heat in this place. I think I'm finally being called back to complete what we interrupted." He died 6 weeks after the interview, on May 3, 1985. The nursing home staff reported that they found him in his bed with a peaceful expression on his face. The room was inexplicably cold. The thermostat showed 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but the staff member who discovered the body said the air felt Arctic and she could see her breath fogging. The window was closed. There was no mechanical explanation for the temperature drop. Most disturbing, Erickson's body showed signs of mild frostbite on his extremities, despite having died indoors, in a heated facility, in spring. Dr. Lindstrom included these details in her research manuscript, The Frostborn of Black Hollow, Death Ritual and Frontier Mysticism in Late 19th Century Alaska, which she submitted to the Journal of American Folklore in 1986. The journal rejected the manuscript, with the editor noting that while the historical research was solid, the inclusion of unverifiable supernatural claims and the focus on what might be a sensitive family tragedy made the work unsuitable for academic publication. Lindstrom revised the manuscript, removing much of the supernatural context, and resubmitted to ethnohistory. That journal also rejected it, this time citing insufficient primary documentation for the central claims. Discouraged but not defeated, Lindstrom continued her research, now focusing on the scientific and archaeological aspects of the case. She made repeated requests to the Boston Museum for access to the book and artifacts, hoping that modern analytical techniques might reveal information unavailable in 1949. The museum initially agreed, then abruptly withdrew permission in 1987, citing conservation concerns. When Lindstrom pressed for explanation, a museum administrator informed her that the artifacts had been deaccessioned, removed from the collection and disposed of according to proper protocols. "Disposed of how?" Lindstrom asked. "That information is confidential under donor agreements," the administrator replied. "But the original donor was anonymous," Lindstrom pointed out. "Nevertheless," the administrator said, and refused to discuss the matter further. The book, the sealed text that had rested on the altar in Black Hollow for decades, was gone. The bone figures, the cloth strips with their cryptic symbols, all of it removed from the historical record as surely as the territorial government had removed the bodies themselves. It was as if someone or something was systematically erasing every trace of the Frostborn. The question that haunted Dr. Lindstrom, the question that should haunt anyone who encounters this history, is not whether the Frostborn achieved what they sought. That question may be unanswerable, existing in the realm of philosophy and theology rather than historical investigation. The question is, why did the events at Black Hollow create such lasting effects on those who discovered the site? Standard explanations invoke psychological mechanisms, suggestion, shared delusion, the power of expectation to shape perception. Erickson and the other survey team members had encountered a deeply disturbing scene. Frozen corpses arranged in ritual configuration, artifacts suggesting occult practices, the oppressive atmosphere of a place long associated with taboo. Their subsequent experiences might be understood as traumatic reactions, their minds attempting to process something that violated their basic assumptions about reality and mortality. This interpretation is supported by what we know about trauma and memory. The brain's response to severe psychological shock can include intrusive memories, dissociative episodes, somatic symptoms without organic cause, all of which parallel what the survey team members reported. From this perspective, the supernatural elements are epiphenomena, the artifacts of minds struggling to cope with profound disturbance. But this explanation, while psychologically sound, does not account for several documented anomalies. How do we explain the frost on the inside of Erickson's window in warm California? The symbols appearing on Holbrook's skin? The temperature drop in Erickson's nursing home room at the moment of his death, recorded not just by subjective experience, but by the thermostat reading afterward, which had inexplicably fallen to 41 degrees Fahrenheit, well below what the heating system should have allowed. These details push us toward alternative frameworks. One possibility invokes environmental factors unique to the Alaska Triangle. Documented magnetic anomalies, unusual geological formations, atmospheric conditions that might affect human neurology in ways we don't yet fully understand. The Alaska Triangle is known for compass malfunctions, unusual radio interference, and other electromagnetic phenomena. Could prolonged exposure to such conditions, combined with the psychological impact of the Black Hollow discovery, have created some form of persistent physiological effect? Dr. Margaret Chen, a neurologist at the University of California, San Francisco, no relation to Peter Chen, the lost surveyor, reviewed Dr. Lindstrom's research materials in 1989 and proposed a geophysical sensitivity hypothesis. Chen suggested that certain geological formations might produce low-frequency electromagnetic fields capable of affecting human consciousness, particularly in individuals who'd experienced significant trauma in the presence of such fields. The symptoms reported by the survey team, intrusive visions, temperature sensitivity, dissociative episodes, could potentially result from long-term neurological changes induced by exposure to these fields during a psychologically vulnerable moment. It's not supernatural, Chen wrote in her analysis, but it might be natural in ways we don't yet understand. The brain is an electromagnetic organ, and we're still discovering how environmental fields interact with neural function. If the Black Hollow site produces unusual electromagnetic signatures, and if exposure to these signatures during a traumatic event created some form of neurological imprinting, then the symptoms might persist long after the initial exposure. This hypothesis is intriguing but difficult to test. Black Hollow's precise location remains unknown. No official survey coordinates were ever recorded, or if they were, the records have been lost or destroyed. The general region described in Thornton's journal, 40 miles southwest of Fairbanks, encompasses hundreds of square miles of wilderness. Without the exact coordinates, electromagnetic surveys of the site are impossible. Which raises another troubling question. Why has no one successfully relocated Black Hollow? The site was discovered in 1947. Thornton's journal provides reasonably detailed directional information. The photographs show distinctive terrain features, the ridges surrounding the hollow, the specific configuration of trees, the angle of the valley. With modern GPS technology, satellite imagery, and computer-assisted terrain matching, finding the location should be straightforward. Yet every attempt to relocate Black Hollow has failed. In 1991, Dr. Lindstrom organized a small expedition, using Thornton's journal entries and the photographs to guide their search. They spent 2 weeks covering the region southwest of Fairbanks, following what should have been the survey team's route. They found nothing. The terrain, Lindstrom noted, seemed subtly wrong. Valleys appeared where the photographs suggested ridges. Streams ran in directions that contradicted Thornton's descriptions. It was as if the landscape itself had changed, or as if they were somehow unable to see what they were looking for. A second expedition in 1998, funded by a paranormal investigation television program, employed GPS technology and hired local guides, including a distant relative of Samuel Kaltag. This expedition ended in disaster when the lead investigator suffered severe frostbite on his hands and feet, despite wearing proper cold-weather gear and despite temperatures that were merely cool, not freezing. He was evacuated by helicopter and later reported that his extremities had felt burning cold and that he'd experienced overwhelming psychological pressure to turn back, to leave, to stop searching. The most recent attempt, in 2009, used satellite imagery analysis to identify potential locations matching the photographic evidence. A team of 4, 2 researchers and 2 experienced backcountry guides, set out in early summer, when conditions should have been optimal. They were reported overdue after 6 days. A search and rescue operation located 3 of them, disoriented but physically unharmed, 12 miles from their last reported position. They claimed to have no memory of the intervening time. The 4th team member was found 2 days later, wandering alone and suffering from hypothermia despite daytime temperatures in the 50s. He remembered only that they'd found something that looked right, but wrong, and that he'd been seized by an uncontrollable urge to run. None of these expeditions located Black Hollow. None of them found the log structure, the frozen bodies, or any evidence that the 1947 discovery had been real. There are several possible explanations for this consistent failure. The most prosaic is that Thornton's coordinates were never accurate, that the photographs are insufficient for terrain matching, and that the Alaska wilderness is simply too vast and too difficult to search effectively. Thousands of locations remained unmapped and unexplored. One more lost homestead is hardly surprising. A second explanation is that the territorial government's 1948 disposal of the site was more thorough than the sparse documentation suggests. That the structures were demolished, the bodies removed, and the location deliberately obscured to prevent future disturbances. This would explain both the failure to relocate the site and the systematic removal of artifacts and documentation. But a third explanation, one that Dr. Lindstrom came to reluctantly accept, is that Black Hollow does not want to be found. That the Frostborn's final ritual did something to the location, something that persists across decades, something that makes the site resistant to rediscovery. This interpretation moves us firmly into the realm of the inexplicable, where conventional science cannot follow. "I don't believe in magic," Lindstrom said in a 1995 interview for an Alaska Public Radio documentary. "But I believe that our understanding of reality is incomplete. I believe that consciousness is stranger than we acknowledge, that the relationship between mind and world is more reciprocal than our materialist paradigm admits. And I believe that what happened at Black Hollow involved some form of that strangeness. Something that 11 people discovered or created or released. Something that continues to exert influence through mechanisms we don't yet comprehend." The Athabascan perspective on these failures is less ambiguous. Thomas Kaltag, interviewed in 2003, said simply, "The place protects itself," or something protects it. "My grandfather said that some places belong to the spirits, and the spirits don't let go easily. You can't find what doesn't want to be found. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe what's there should stay there." The academic community has largely ignored the Black Hollow mystery, dismissing it as an urban legend or a historical misinterpretation. No peer-reviewed articles address the case. Dr. Lindstrom's research remains unpublished in formal academic channels, existing only as manuscripts circulated among independent researchers and posted on obscure corners of the internet. The photographs that surfaced in 1983 have been analyzed by image authentication experts, with inconclusive results. They're genuine period photographs, not modern forgeries, but their provenance cannot be definitively established. In the absence of academic interest, Black Hollow has become the province of amateur investigators, paranormal enthusiasts, and internet conspiracists. Online forums dedicated to Alaska Triangle mysteries regularly feature threads about the Frostborn, filled with speculation ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Some claim the Frostborn were practicing an ancient Scandinavian shamanic technique, attempting to achieve a state called utiseta, sitting out in nature to receive visions. Others suggest involvement with early theosophy or Russian mysticism, linking the case to similar esoteric movements in Siberia. A few propose extraterrestrial intervention or interdimensional phenomena. Most of these theories are poorly evidenced and easily dismissed, but they reflect a genuine hunger for explanation, a collective sense that the Black Hollow story touches something fundamental about human existence, our relationship with death, our desire for transcendence, our fear of what might lie beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. Because at its core, the Black Hollow mystery is a story about a threshold. The Frostborn believed they had found a way to cross a boundary that all humans face but none survive. The boundary between life and death, between warmth and cold, between the known and the utterly unknown. Whether they succeeded or failed, whether their ritual achieved enlightenment or damnation or nothing at all, their attempt marked the landscape in ways that persist. They left a wound in the world, and that wound has not healed. The survey team that discovered them in 1947 became, in a sense, secondary victims, contaminated by proximity to something that should have remained undisturbed, carrying that contamination with them for the rest of their lives. And perhaps that contamination persists still, waiting for the next person curious enough or foolish enough to seek out the hollow without a name, the place that refuses to be found, the site where 11 souls attempted to trade mortality for something else, something terrible and cold and eternal. What became of the book? This question haunts every investigation of the Black Hollow mystery, because the book represents the only direct communication from the Frostborn themselves, the only artifact that might explain, in their own words, what they believed, what they sought, and what they might have achieved. The book was examined briefly in 1949 before being sealed and placed in the Boston Museum's collection. The examiner's report, a single typewritten page that Dr. Lindstrom obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request to a tangentially related federal agency, provides minimal detail. The book was described as approximately 8 inches by 10 inches, bound in leather, 157 pages of text written in English, with occasional passages in what appears to be Old Norse and Latin. Content appears to be devotional in nature, with extensive instructions for meditation and ritual practice. Specific contents withheld per institutional confidentiality protocols. The examiner noted that the ink appeared to be iron gall, common in the 19th century, and that the handwriting was consistent throughout, suggesting a single author. Chemical analysis of the leather binding indicated it was not cowhide or pigskin, the usual materials, but something else. The report speculated possibly seal or walrus skin, appropriate for Arctic conditions, though the analysis was not definitive. No scholar was permitted to read the book's contents in full. No photographs were taken of its pages. When the museum deaccessioned the artifact in 1987, the book disappeared from human knowledge as completely as if it had never been recovered from the hollow. But fragments survived. The 1949 examiner had included in his report a brief excerpt, presumably selected as an example of the book's content, innocuous enough to not violate confidentiality, but sufficient to characterize its nature. This excerpt, 43 words from an unspecified page, is the only direct quote from the Frostborn's own writings that remains accessible. In the moment of ultimate surrender, when breath ceases and warmth flees, the soul recognizes what it has always known, that life is the prison and cold is the key. We do not die, we do not end, we simply remember what we were before birth bound us. These words have been analyzed exhaustively by independent researchers. Their theological implications are complex. They suggest a Gnostic worldview, a belief that material existence is a form of imprisonment, and that death offers liberation rather than annihilation. The phrase, "remember what we were before birth," implies pre-existence of the soul, a concept found in Platonism, certain Buddhist traditions, and various mystical movements. But the practical implications are more disturbing. If the Frostborn genuinely believed that freezing to death was not suicide, but a form of awakening, then their final ritual was not an act of despair, but one of hope, a deliberate choice to cross a threshold they believed would lead to enlightenment. They died, if the evidence is accurate, with peaceful expressions, with no struggle, with the calm certainty of those who know exactly what they're doing and why. Did they succeed? Did they remember what they were before birth? Did they achieve the liberation they sought? We cannot know, but we can observe that their deaths created effects that persisted long after their bodies froze, effects experienced by everyone who came into significant contact with their ritual site, effects that seem to transcend normal psychological trauma. Effects that suggest, however impossibly, that the Frostborn's beliefs might have contained some grain of terrible truth. Dr. Gregory Walsh, a scholar of religious studies at Brown University, who briefly corresponded with Dr. Lindstrom before his unexpected death in 1994, proposed what he called the resonance theory. Walsh suggested that certain beliefs, held with sufficient intensity and expressed through sufficiently focused ritual, might create what he termed ontological ripples, changes not in objective reality per se, but in the relationship between consciousness and reality, affecting how subsequent observers experience a location or object associated with the belief. The Frostborn didn't necessarily achieve physical immortality or literal transcendence, Walsh wrote, but their absolute conviction, their total commitment to their belief system, combined with the intensity of their final ritual, may have imprinted something on that location, a kind of psychological or metaphysical residue that affects everyone who encounters it afterward. It's not that the site is haunted by ghosts, but that it's haunted by belief itself, by the sheer force of conviction that 11 people brought to bear on a single moment in time. This theory exists in a gray area between psychology and metaphysics, neither fully scientific nor entirely mystical. It proposes that consciousness can, under certain conditions, leave lasting impressions on the material world, not through supernatural mechanisms, but through natural processes we don't yet understand. It's speculative, unfalsifiable, and precisely the kind of thinking that prevents academic publication. But it offers a framework for understanding why Black Hollow might resist rediscovery, not because of literal magic, but because the Frostborn's collective will, focused through their final ritual, created some form of perceptual barrier, a psychological field effect that makes the location difficult to perceive or approach. Those who seek it feel compelled to turn back, to look elsewhere, to give up. The landscape seems wrong, the directions misleading, the search hopeless. If Walsh's theory has merit, then the book itself, as the central text of the Frostborn's belief system, the physical instantiation of their theological framework, would be the most intensely charged artifact. Reading it would not simply transmit information, It would expose the reader to the full force of the Frostborn's conviction, potentially creating the same kind of psychological or metaphysical contamination that affected the survey team. This might explain why the book was sealed so quickly after initial examination, why so few people were allowed access to it, why it was eventually destroyed or hidden so thoroughly. Someone, the 1949 examiner, the museum administrators, perhaps even the territorial government officials who orchestrated the original cover-up, recognized that the book was dangerous, not in its content alone, but in what it represented and what it might do to those who engaged with it too deeply. Dr. Lindstrom became convinced toward the end of her research that the book should never be found. "I wanted to read it," she said in that 1995 interview. "God help me, I wanted to know what they believed, what they thought they'd discovered. But after talking to Erickson, after learning what happened to the survey team, I realized that some knowledge is not meant for us, not because it's forbidden by some external authority, but because we're not equipped to handle it. The Frostborn found something, a technique, a practice, a way of perceiving reality that human minds are not built to contain, and they encoded it in that book. Whoever reads it risks becoming what they became, obsessed, transformed, lost to the same cold they embraced." Lindstrom died in 2001 at the age of 58 of an apparent heart attack while hiking alone in the Chugach Mountains outside Anchorage. Her death was ruled accidental, though friends noted that she had been in excellent health and was an experienced hiker unlikely to have succumbed to ordinary cardiac arrest. She was found with her GPS unit active, but the coordinates it displayed placed her position 12 miles from where her body was actually located, an impossibility that was attributed to equipment malfunction. In her jacket pocket, searchers found a handwritten note on a torn piece of paper. It read, "The hollow is real. The cold is true. Forgive me." In the 78 years since the survey team discovered Black Hollow, 43 people have vanished in the general region where the site is believed to be located. This number is not exceptional for Alaska wilderness. People disappear regularly in the vast uninhabited regions, victims of weather, terrain, wildlife, or simple misadventure. But 16 of these 43 disappearances occurred between November and March, the coldest months, when rational people avoid backcountry travel. 7 of the disappeared had documented connections to the Black Hollow mystery. They'd researched the case, attempted to find the site, or expressed explicit interest in the Frostborn's beliefs. The most recent was in 2017, when a 34-year-old software engineer from Seattle named Marcus Rebb, no relation to the journalist who'd investigated the Boston Museum, posted on an Alaska Triangle forum that he'd decoded the location from Thornton's journal and was heading into the wilderness to document his findings. He was reported missing after failing to return from a solo winter camping trip. His vehicle was found at a trailhead southwest of Fairbanks. His tent and supplies were discovered 3 miles from the road, neatly arranged as if he'd made camp intentionally. But Webb himself was gone. Search and rescue dogs tracked his scent for half a mile beyond the camp, then lost it completely in an open area with good visibility and no terrain features that might explain his disappearance. The search was eventually called off due to severe weather. Webb's body was never recovered. His laptop, found in the tent, contained extensive research files on Black Hollow. Copies of Thornton's journal entries, the photographs, Dr. Lindstrom's unpublished manuscripts, and a document titled The Frostborn Practice, a reconstruction that appeared to be Webb's own attempt to extrapolate the group's beliefs and rituals from the available evidence. Alaska State Troopers examined the laptop as part of the missing person investigation. The contents of Webb's reconstruction document have never been publicly released, but one investigator, speaking off the record to a journalist in 2019, said, "It read like a religious text crossed with a suicide manual. very calm, very logical, very convinced of its own truth. It talked about using cold as a meditation tool, about the states of consciousness accessible only at the threshold of hypothermia, about techniques for remaining aware as the body shuts down. It was disturbing. If I believed in such things, I'd say it was dangerous. Not because it encouraged suicide exactly, but because it made dying of cold seem like an accomplishment, like the ultimate spiritual experience. Should we blame the Frostborn for these modern disappearances? They've been dead for over a century, their names unknown, their beliefs transmitted only through fragments and rumors. They did not ask to become a mystery. They sought privacy, isolation, a place to practice their faith without interference. It was the survey team's intrusion, the subsequent publicity, however limited, and the modern obsession with inexplicable phenomena that transformed them into an object of fascination and danger. Or perhaps responsibility lies with something more impersonal, the human drive to find meaning in death, to believe that mortality is not a biological terminus, but a transition to something else. The Frostborn offered what all mystery cults offer, a promise that death is conquerable through knowledge, through practice, through access to secret truths. That promise has attracted seekers for millennia, from the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece to the modern interest in near-death experiences and consciousness survival. The specifics change, but the underlying hunger remains constant. Black Hollow is simply the latest iteration of an ancient pattern, the sacred site, the dangerous knowledge, the threshold that some cross and others only approach. It's the cave that should not be entered, the book that should not be read, the name that should not be spoken. These are archetypes older than recorded history, and they persist because they touch something fundamental in human psychology: our awareness of our own mortality, our desperate hope that death is not the end, and our intuition that some knowledge comes with costs too high to pay. The Alaska Triangle provides the perfect setting for such stories. It's a liminal space, a boundary region where civilization thins to nothing and the old wild powers remain in force. It's a place where people go to be alone, to test themselves, to find what cannot be found in gentler landscapes. And sometimes they find exactly what they're looking for, which may be the most dangerous outcome of all. Because the Frostborn, by all evidence, did find what they sought. They discovered or developed a practice, a technique, a way of engaging with death that worked, at least in the sense that it allowed them to die with certainty and peace. Whether that practice also delivered the promised transcendence, the remembering they believed awaited beyond the threshold, we cannot know. But their absolute conviction, preserved in the peaceful expressions frozen on their faces, suggests they died believing they had succeeded. And that belief has power. It radiates outward through time, affecting everyone who encounters the story seriously. What if they were right? What if death by freezing, approached with the correct mental state, with the proper preparation, with sufficient conviction, does open a door to something else? Most of us answer that question with the comforting certitudes of materialism. Death is death. Consciousness ends. There is no door because there is nowhere for a door to lead. But the certitude wobbles when confronted with the details of Black Hollow. The persistent anomalies, the documented experiences of rational people who encountered the site or its artifacts, the strange pattern of disappearances and deaths that cluster around the mystery like iron filings around a magnet. We are left, finally, with uncertainty. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Frostborn. Not proof of life after death, not validation of any particular theological system, but the unsettling recognition that our understanding of reality is incomplete, that the boundaries between mind and world are more permeable than we wish to believe, and that some questions remain unanswerable not because we lack sufficient data, but because the answers exist in a space our ordinary consciousness cannot reach. The winter landscape of interior Alaska is a study in absolute extremes. Temperatures plunge to 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The air itself becomes a hostile element, capable of freezing exposed skin in minutes. Breath crystallizes instantly, forming ice fog around the face. Sound changes quality, becoming muted and strange as the cold air compresses. The light, during the brief hours of winter sun, is pale and indirect, casting shadows that seem more real than the objects that create them. In such conditions, the human body is a precarious island of warmth in an ocean of cold. The core temperature must be defended at all costs. Every calorie is allocated to keeping the vital organs functional. Every shiver is a tactical retreat from the extremities toward the fortress of the chest and abdomen. Lose that battle, and hypothermia begins. First, the confusion. Then the paradoxical undressing, as dying nerves misfire and create the illusion of burning heat. Then the terminal burrowing instinct that drives victims to crawl into small spaces as consciousness finally fails. It is, by any measure, an ugly way to die. And yet the Frostborn chose it deliberately, even enthusiastically, as the culmination of their spiritual practice. What did they experience in those final moments? What did they see or feel or understand as their core temperatures dropped and their brains began the cascade of shutdown that ends in death? We have some scientific understanding of hypothermia's effects on consciousness. As body temperature falls below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, cognitive function deteriorates. Confusion, amnesia, impaired judgment. Below 90 degrees, muscular rigidity sets in and heart rate slows dramatically. Below 82 degrees, most people lose consciousness. Below 75 degrees, cardiac arrest becomes likely. But the subjective experience is less well documented. Survivors of severe hypothermia often report strange perceptions, a sense of peace, visions of welcoming figures, out-of-body experiences, memories of childhood or of places they've never actually been. Some describe a feeling of profound understanding, a sense that they're perceiving truths normally hidden from waking consciousness. These reports are usually attributed to oxygen deprivation and neural dysfunction, the dying brain's last, desperate misfirings. But what if consciousness does change at the threshold of death? What if the breakdown of normal neural function doesn't produce mere hallucination, but rather removes filters that normally constrain perception? This is the essential claim of many mystical traditions, that ordinary consciousness is not the full range of possible awareness, but rather a narrow, survival-focused mode that screens out the majority of reality. Alter the brain's function, through meditation, through drugs, through oxygen deprivation, through hypothermia, and other modes of consciousness become accessible. The Frostborn appear to have believed a version of this theory. Their practice, as reconstructed from fragments, involved using cold as a tool for expanding awareness. They would expose themselves to progressively lower temperatures while maintaining meditative focus, training themselves to remain conscious and alert even as their bodies began to shut down. The goal was to find the exact boundary, the point where the body ceased maintaining warmth but before consciousness was fully extinguished, and to remain in that boundary state, observing what could be observed there. It's a practice with precedence. Tibetan Tomo meditation involves generating body heat through visualization and breath control, allowing practitioners to remain comfortable in extreme cold. Various shamanic traditions use controlled hypothermia as a trance-induction technique. The Frostborn seem to have inverted this. Rather than using meditation to resist cold, they used cold to deepen meditation, believing that the descent into hypothermia paralleled a descent into deeper levels of consciousness. Their final ritual, then, was not suicide in the conventional sense. It was an attempt to go as deep as possible, to push past the boundary where ordinary practitioners would retreat, to find out what existed on the other side of death itself. They sat in their circle, in their unheated structure in the depths of an Alaska winter, and they descended together into cold and consciousness and whatever lay beyond. Did they find what they sought? The question cannot be answered empirically, but we can observe that they did not panic, did not struggle, did not break formation. Whatever they experienced in those final hours, it was sufficiently compelling that all 11 of them remained committed to the process until consciousness failed and their hearts stopped beating. And we can observe that the site where this occurred has remained, in some sense, active. Whether through psychological suggestion, through environmental anomalies, through quantum entanglement of intention, as one physicist briefly speculated in a paper rejected by Physical Review letters, or through mechanisms entirely unknown to science, Black Hollow continues to affect those who approach it with awareness of its history. Thomas Kaltag's grandfather said, "The place remembers." Memory implies persistence, implies that the past is not fully past but continues to exist in some form, accessible under the right conditions. If Black Hollow remembers, what does it remember? The Frostborn's final hours? Their beliefs? Their conviction that they were crossing a threshold into something greater? Or does it remember something even older? The reason the Athabascan people called it Yegatzin, the hollow without a name, long before white settlers arrived. Was there something about that specific location, some quality of place, that made it suitable for the Frostborn's purpose? Did they choose the hollow, or did the hollow, in some sense, choose them? These questions lead into territory where reason cannot follow, where evidence becomes ambiguous and interpretation becomes unavoidable. We're left with stories, with fragments, with the testimony of people who experienced things they could not adequately explain. We're left with mystery. And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the Frostborn's ultimate legacy is not their beliefs or their deaths, but the space of uncertainty they opened up. A reminder that for all our scientific advancement, for all our technological mastery, there remain corners of human experience that resist full explanation. Death remains unknown territory. Consciousness remains fundamentally mysterious. And certain places in the world seem to concentrate that mystery, to make it palpable, to force us to confront the limits of our understanding. Black Hollow is such a place. It stands somewhere in the Alaska wilderness, unmarked and unfound, a testament to human aspiration and human folly, to the desire for transcendence and the price of seeking it. The Frostborn lie there still, frozen in their circle, their faces peaceful, their secret, whatever it was, locked in the silence of their stopped hearts. They will not speak again. The cold has claimed their voices, as it claims everything eventually in that unforgiving landscape. But their presence persists, and their question echoes across the decades. What waits beyond the threshold? What remembers itself when warmth finally fails and the long cold begins? The Alaska Triangle holds many mysteries. Black Hollow may be the deepest, not because of what happened there, but because of what it suggests about the relationship between belief and reality, between consciousness and death, between the world we think we know and the world that exists in the spaces between certainty. On winter nights, when the temperature plunges and the darkness stretches 15 hours or more, those who live in interior Alaska sometimes report strange sensations, a feeling of being watched, a sense that the landscape is aware, a conviction that they're not quite alone even in the midst of vast emptiness. Rational people dismiss these feelings as projection, as the psychological effects of isolation and extreme environment. But others wonder. They remember the stories, the Frostborn, the survey team, the searchers who failed to return. They remember that some places are sacred and some are cursed, and some, perhaps, are both. They remember that 11 people once believed they could trade mortality for enlightenment, and that the place where they made that trade has never fully released the memory of their choice. Black Hollow waits. It has waited for over a century, and it will wait centuries more, patient as only inanimate things can be patient. And those who seek it, driven by curiosity or obsession or the ancient human hunger for hidden knowledge, will continue to venture into the wilderness, following fragmentary maps and ambiguous directions, searching for the place that refuses to be found. Some will return, disappointed and empty-handed, convinced that the story is myth or exaggeration. Others will return changed, speaking of experiences they struggle to articulate, of cold that felt almost conscious, of moments when the boundary between self and landscape seemed to dissolve. And a few will not return at all. They will join the long list of the disappeared, the ones who walked into the Alaska Triangle and never walked out, whose fates remain unknown, whose last moments are recorded only in the silence they leave behind. If the Frostborn could speak, what would they say to these seekers? Would they offer warning or encouragement? Would they share the knowledge they died believing they'd gained? Or would they keep their silence, recognizing that some truths cannot be transmitted, only experienced? We will never know. The dead do not speak, or if they do, they speak in languages we cannot understand. But their legacy endures, not in words or doctrines, but in the persistence of mystery itself, in the recognition that death remains the ultimate unknown, and in the terrible freedom of those who choose to confront that unknown on their own terms, whatever the cost. The snow falls on Black Hollow as it has for 100 years. The wind moves through the frozen trees, and somewhere beneath the ice and snow and accumulated time, 11 souls rest in their circle, their work complete or abandoned, their question answered or left forever hanging. 11 witnesses to a threshold that the rest of us will cross only once, and never return to tell what we found there.